Hello and welcome to China Chat, where we tackle the big subjects with the best guests. Today, it's all about education. I'm Mark Llewellyn, and with me I have Professor Tim Harcourt, Professor Chris Ferry, Counsellor of International Relations Rebecca Yang, and Yilan Wu, Research Science student at Sydney University. Can I begin with you, Yilan? Have Chinese students turned their backs on Australia, or is Australia still a good place to study?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. With the good quality of education, most Chinese students still choose Australia as their first choice of studying abroad.
Well, you speak to them all the time. Why do you think there's still that desire to come to Australia?
Yeah, because firstly, the very unique and gorgeous view here,
Yeah,
natural
so nice
world,
to hear.
and also the people is very friendly, and most importantly, the high quality of education.
High quality of education is a
Yeah.
real selling point.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, you're right at the coalface, so to speak. What does it mean for Australia, this education industry, particularly with China?
Was a $40 billion industry, Mark, and of course in the decade before the pandemic hit, China accounted for a third of our education exports. So it's a big deal for Australia. And when we saw the pandemic hit, around 70% of the revenue lost from international enrolments was due to the drop in China. So it's a big deal. But I must say this, Mark, we do talk a lot about the numbers and how important it is to our economy, but I think also the people connections are so important for the national education. I'll give an example.
Yeah.
When I was at Adelaide Uni back in the last century, my honours class in economics, 90% of people came from Singapore because Lee Kuan Yew had sent all these guys who were meant to do nuclear physics or rocket science at Oxford. He sent them to do economics at Adelaide. So my grades got pulled up and I became a chief economist and a professor and all the rest. And when I now go to Singapore, the head of the civil service, the Minister for Industry, they're all Australian educated. So I think the numbers matter, but I think the human interaction and the relationships you make helps you way after you're finished.
Well, both Rebecca and Chris, I saw you nodding in agreement there. Rebecca, if I could go to you first. These relationships, so more important than money, a big part of this deal that we have?
Well, I definitely would agree because for me, as someone working in the local government for over 10 years, the people-to-people connections, particularly like the on the grassroots level, that's something very strong and can lead to very big results. Examples like our friendship and the relationship with our sister cities in China and all over the world can actually bring in lots of economic impact to Australia and also to our sister cities overseas. Back in the education sector, I totally agree. I mean, people-to-people connections, our friendship, and how we look at each other on the grassroots level, that's going to be something driving the whole relationship forward to another level. So I totally agree.
Well, Chris, if I can take that a step further, in a time of tension, is it really important to keep hold of these interpersonal, people-to-people relationships?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a physicist in an area where, in a field that just kind of grew up as an international collaboration. And so it's essential to maintain these relationships. Theoretical physics not so concerned with economics. And so really the question is quite simple for us. It's about people and collaboration.
Well, you find that when you go over to China, you're mobbed, aren't you? That's what I'm hearing. That you get a great result because of your books.
Yes, well, I think, especially in physics, I've noticed there's huge cultural differences in the the importance that's placed on basic science versus other technical disciplines. And so I think from my experience, basic science in China hasn't been so important. So these books, which introduce high-level science concepts to kids, really kind of hit some sort of nerve with people there, thinking maybe this is important.
Well, I should explain there. So some of the book's titles are Quantum Physics for Babies, Newtonian Physics for Babies, General Relativity for Babies, Rocket Science for Babies. You see, even I had trouble with that, but the concept is brilliant, to get children engaged in education. How did Mark Zuckerberg help?
Yeah, so Mark Zuckerberg shared a photo of himself and his partner reading Quantum Physics for Babies to their firstborn child, and he said it was his book of the year.
Oh wow!
Although, if you read further down the post, he kind of said it a bit tongue-in-cheek.
I might diverge here and stay with you 1 second. It's interesting in a world where kids are addicted to devices, that you have the ability to talk to them through your books. How important is that?
It's amazing. Kids, they really do appreciate that tactile response that they get from touching and feeling books and turning pages that you don't get on a screen, on a device. And I think the major problem with devices is that it's so easily used as, quote unquote,
a
babysitter. Whereas a book forces you to sit there with the child and engage with them. And I think that's really important.
But you're not underestimating anybody's intelligence here. You think people of a young age are able to understand these concepts and grow early.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to pass a quantum physics.
Well, neither am I.
after they're done the book, but I think it's important that not only children but parents realize that these ideas, they're not reserved for people with PhDs. They really belong to all of us, and we should all be able to have the opportunity to appreciate it.
Well, Tim, you've written a number of books yourself. You've also been passionate about, pre the pandemic, taking your honours students across to China. Why is it that you feel the need to have that cross-pollination?
Yeah, my books weren't launched by Mark Zuckerberg, but I did get Kevin Rudd and Julie Gillard to do a few. But as soon as a Prime Minister launched my book, they got rolled. So I'll have to stick to.
You're the black mock.
Economist or some other kind of celebrity launched a book now, like Chris has done. I took all my MBA classes to China regularly before the pandemic, and we did it quite deliberately that we would start in Hong Kong and then go to either Shanghai or Beijing as one of the big, large international cities, and then we deliberately went to a second or third tier city, little country towns with 20 million people like Chongqing and Chengdu and Qingdao and Xi'an. So we wanted to give our students a feel for Western China, second and third tier cities, the countryside, as well as very international places like Shanghai. And I think that helped a lot. I think some of my students had only been to Chinatown; they hadn't been to China itself. A lot of my students were, in fact, all my students were very multicultural classes. So when I showed up and said this is the MBA class from Sydney, Australia, most of the Chinese instructors thought we'd be the cast of Home and Away with blonde hair and surfboards, but we were Thai and Chinese origin and Jewish and Brazilian and African, all sorts of things, as well as Vegemite Aussie. So I think it was good for our students to learn a lot about China, but also I thought it was good for China and the classes we took to Japan and Korea and India and Brazil and Chile, also to see what a modern Australia looks like too. And I think they were quite pleasantly surprised, particularly when we had a number of Chinese Australians and Chinese students in our classes. I might also add, I like Rebecca's point about local government connections and state government connections. When I was working for the Premier of South Australia, we actually took delegations to Qingdao in the north, where the beer's from and the wine's from, because we had a natural affinity with that city. And I, in fact, made the airport economist in Qingdao at the time of the beer festival. That's a coincidence. And I found that's worked very well. We had a winemaker from Adelaide who was making Shiraz Hill, and she found that Shanghai was very difficult because the French and the Chileans and the South Africans and the Germans were there. So she concentrated on a second tier city and really made that her market, and that worked out very well. And because of the ties between South Australia and Shandong province at the state level, that worked very well as the city connection. So there's a lot to be said. Everything can't just be Sydney and Shanghai. You do have to look at other regions in China and other parts of Australia.
Well, to bring Rebecca in on that point, the connection's clearly important between cities and communities, but ultimately people. And one of the things that have happened recently is the pandemic, which has seen a lot of people work remotely, and so few students come out to Australia, and vice versa in terms of how has that caused problems, and what's the solution moving forward?
That's a really good question. In my opinion, firstly, although the pandemic has been keeping us apart, and we are all actually working from home, and we all have to struggle with these technical issues, but still, technologies help us a lot. We have to admit that. Sometimes I know we hate it very much, but we still love it because it helps us. So, in my opinion, yes, the pandemic completely changed the whole landscape in terms of like international engagement, in terms of like how we communicate with each other, as well as how the students could actually study and how they learn. So the whole pattern has got changed. But I still can see opportunities out of all this I call it a crisis.
Yeah.
But the opportunities here is, firstly, definitely we can use the technologies. For example, I understand that most of the students are actually doing their classes online. Although it is not, well, in my opinion, probably not as nice as to have that face-to-face moments for the like personal communications, but at the same time, it provides lots of convenience. For example, I got like lots of friends stay in China but already finished their degree, and then they are having their graduations. It is something that if we look at it from another angle, it provides lots of like opportunities, and it opens doors for them, probably can save them from physical travels. So I think look at the bright side. I think the technology could definitely be the key to solve the half of the crisis, but at the same time, we do need to provide more of the human interactions to bring that face-to-face communications, to bring the students back to meet with each other, to talk to each other, particularly about that social-wise, that element, back to education, which can contribute even more to help them to grow, to help with their self-development.
Well, Yilan, you know all about that because you see the students come out here. And I mean, it's like a big rite of passage, isn't it? You're away from home many times for the first time. You maybe have your first romance, first big drink. You learn about how to manage a budget. And that interpersonal relationship was kind of lost during the pandemic. But is it coming back?
Yeah, I think people learn more to the importance of connect with each other from the pandemic, because they are keeping apart during that time, and we are more keen on to do more offline events to bring the students together and share the relationship.
What's the biggest thing that universities and education places in Australia could do to make life easier for somebody coming from China for the first time? It's clearly not with English as the first language. So how would you make things better, more attractive?
Our university have a all-week orientation week to welcome all the students, especially who are international students.
Yeah.
And they also had a pickup program at the airport to pick up students. So maybe they could have some English tutoring class, because the language barrier is a huge challenges for the international students, and especially they are not familiar with the local life or local culture, to help students get used to the local life and make more
to ease the transition.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Chris, just in terms of overseas students that you see passing by? Do you feel that there are areas that we miss and things that we could do better?
It's lately it's very, very hard to tell because I'm been doing all my lecturing online. And
Can I stop you there? How do you find that? Do you find that invigorating, or do you find that a problem? Do you lose that connection?
You know, when I first started as a physicist, you enjoy challenges. So I enjoyed the challenge of making it work, and I felt like I did that to the best of my ability to make it work in the worst of the situation that we were in. But you know, in hindsight, I feel like it doesn't work nearly as well as face to face.
And why is that? Why is that?
It's just the connection. So when we first started teaching online, we encouraged people to participate, put their cameras on. Imagine we were having this conversation and all of our cameras were off.
Yeah.
That's what it would be like. So it got to the point where people started to get kind of bored or lazy or just sick of it, and they stopped engaging during the online lessons. And so when you're face to face, you can gauge people's reactions. A lot of cues that you can't get through an online system. So in hindsight, after going through both over the years and trying to optimize both situations, I feel like the face-to-face is just strictly better.
The other thing is your expertise is science. It's my understanding that science and science teaching in Australia is one of the big attractions. Is Australia still at the forefront, or is there a risk we've become complacent? What is your view?
I think that it really depends on the field. So in the field of research that I'm in, quantum technology, I mean, you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm not originally Australian, but I picked up a few terms. So one of them that people like to throw around in Australia is punching above your weight. So in my field, Australia was really punching above their weight, and that's the reason that I'm here in Australia, because in the area of research that I'm in, Australia was one of the best places in the world to do it. But as restrictions and various policies making it more and more difficult to collaborate with people overseas, and including physically going and seeing people overseas, became more difficult. Even in my field, where Australia does really well traditionally, you can feel like we are becoming more and more isolated.
And what's the reason for that?
Well, quantum technology is it's a really new field, but it's treated as becoming closer and closer to something that ought to be a restricted technology.
Yeah.
And so, relevant to this discussion, we see far fewer international higher degree research students from China simply because they can't get visas. So I had a student wait for a year for a visa. I have a student waiting for a visa right now. And even if these sort of delays are small, these things add up. And what you tend to do is kind of do the thing that's easiest. So you collaborate with the people that are next to you, and you take students that are able to come now, not students that have to wait for...
Sorry to interrupt, but there's also the risk of word of mouth. If somebody can't get a visa, then they'll tell somebody else it's difficult to get to Australia, and then the other options become more viable, like Britain or America.
That's right, yep.
You're watching and listening to China Chat. I'm going to move now to Professor Tim Harcourt, because that is a big issue. In a very competitive environment, you have other players like Britain and America who also want the students that Australia is getting to come to them as well. How big of an issue is that?
It's interesting, isn't it? When COVID hit, people expected a bigger decline, and then when the UK opened up earlier than we did. They expected to lose a lot of market share, but it hasn't happened to the expectations that people were worried about. I think one reason is a lot of students are looking for permanent residency. They actually want to settle in Australia, and for that reason, Australia will give them a high quality education and the chance of a new life. And that's a lot of the story of higher education in Australia in the last 20 years, and we've benefited from that with some of our great scientists here at UTS that helped work on COVID and SARS before, and secondly, a lot of the entrepreneurs. Even before COVID, in 1989, Bob Hawke led a lot of students in, gave them permanent residency, and a lot of them have become great entrepreneurs that have done fantastic things between Australia and China. So I think that's quite a good reason. And also the availability of work. Australia's got a strong economy, so the capacity to pick up part-time jobs and internships for Chinese and other overseas students in Australia is pretty high. And we have success stories like Rebecca, for instance, working for the Lord Mayor. So that's a very good example of that. I was really intrigued by Chris's discussion, as my wife works in physics at University of New South Wales and in the Girls Do the Maths program, which is now Do the Maths. What's interesting to me is to what degree countries try and specialise in STEMs, in science, technology, engineering and maths. Singapore was concerned they had too many people in maths and science, and they were producing lots of engineers and superannuation consultants, but not enough ballet dancers or poets. So they put in the Government Gazette, you should be creative from 10 to 12 on Saturdays, compulsory.
That's going to work.
Similarly, in China and South Korea, a lot of countries have been worried that maybe we're putting too much eggs in the science basket, and maybe the humanities and the social sciences are also important. And yet Australia's going the other way. So I was really interested in what Chris was saying about, in certain areas like quantum physics, Australia's quite strong, because universities like University of New South Wales have closed down fine arts, which was around for a century, and they've closed down humanities to put all their eggs in the STEMs basket. And and after the pandemic, we met a lot of Chinese students that were professors now of Australian literature at Western Sydney University and here at UTS. So I wondered to what extent Australia's been too STEMs focused, and we're not thinking of our comparative advantage.
You need a more rounded diet.
Countries like China and South Korea going the other way.
Yeah, you were nodding to that. You believe that there's an importance beyond just the STEM subjects.
Yeah, I think so. But myself is a STEM student. I cannot deny that Australia is very advanced in these subjects and area. But also many of my friends who are studying the faculty, so most are in the international relations. Is that a new idea or a new opinion for you guys? But so I think they believe Australia also have that advantage in this field.
Well, I think speaking to some of the people prior to doing this, that there are other intangible advantages that people like, climate being one of them. Coming out here and seeing blue sky, that sort of thing. What do you see as some of the attractions beyond, the actual learning?
Maybe Australia is a multicultural society.
Is that a very big deal?
Yeah, because people come here can experience a different life than their original country, or they want to feel something different. So that's maybe one of the factors attracted them to come here.
Do you feel that as well, Rebecca?
Yes, definitely.
That's a big yes.
Just some statistics to support multicultural society and how Sydney has been a global city and an international hub. So the first figure I'd like to share is about, I was told by my colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade, and Sydney is actually the home for the second, Sydney got like the second largest number of consulate corps and foreign government representatives right after New York. That's all over the world. And another fact is about, we now have more than 35% of our population in only the city of Sydney's local government area were born in overseas. So, which means like in terms of like this society, it does provide something rather than just Australian culture, but it is a very successful model of a multicultural society. That is something can be the magnet to international students as well. And I believe we all agreed, we all talked about like social-wise, how we should interact with each other. And that that's supposed to be like a strength Australian education can provide to the international students. So I think after the pandemic, the very important element the Australian society and Australian education could offer probably to the students and to the whole international community would be the multiculturalism, that element, and that colorful social life and that welcoming message and atmosphere that we can actually offer to the students.
Colourful social life. It's one of the ingredients, is it?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, definitely. Well, I talk about it from a positive aspect. So colorful, yes, that's the word.
I mentioned before, I think you're spot on. It's fun to hear, to be honest. It's kind of like a rite of passage coming to a country like Australia. It's warm, it's friendly, but it has its unique differences. What was it like for you for the first time?
I like the question. I'm always telling people I was literally the first native Chinese who was not born in Australia but came from China about 12 years ago, and the first international student got hired in a political office and been carrying on a very important portfolio in the city for this long time. I was looking after the City of Sydney's international engagement as well as multicultural relations, so which actually used my cultural background and my skills and my cultural awareness and the cross-cultural understanding to support my career path, to support myself in this whole progression of myself in the career-wise. So what I can share, and I'm always very proud about, is about like this story I see myself, I am humbled, but I see myself as a very successful I wouldn't say role model, but a case that Australia accepted me as someone with special techniques and skills, and it offered me with all these opportunities. It opened doors to someone like me to use my talents and my skills and the knowledge I have learned from the Australian education, as well as, of course, from the degrees I've got from China, and it supported me to pursue a career path. I see this as something very, very amazing. Like it gave me lots of different kind of like energies to support me to pursue something different. Because not many, as far as I know, not many international students would pursue career in public sector. But I would definitely encourage them to do so because, firstly, the Australian government, particularly about the whole Australian public sector, is currently building up its capacity around to cope with what they call the Asian century. I remember, firstly, when I heard about it from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's white paper, I deeply believed that it will be the Asian century and my skills will be utilized in the best way to support the Australia-China relations, to support the people-to-people connections, and to support the development of all the aspects. Because as we all agreed, as everyone just mentioned about their experience visiting China, it all starts from this understanding, that it all starts from this face-to-face meetings, social with each other, the communications to build up the trust to achieve more in many other aspects. So back to my own experience, I do believe that be bold, be adventurous, and I would encourage everyone to seriously think about your career path rather than just staying probably within something you're familiar with, but just to explore more opportunities.
Chris, do those words resonate with you as well, to be bold and adventurous? What was your experience when you came out to Australia?
The weather is certainly warmer than Canada.
Where were you coming from?
Well, to be fair, I was coming from probably one of the warmer places in Canada, in southern Ontario. I lived in the U.S. for 2 years, and so that was an interesting transition from Canada to the U.S. and then to Australia. And Australia felt a lot more like
Yeah.
home than the U.S. did, in terms of culture. So I think, but as an academic, you kind of travel around the world quite a bit, sometimes out of necessity. And I found that, generally speaking, when you speak to an individual person anywhere in the world, we're all the same. We're all kind of.
It's a really comforting notion, particularly in a time of tension. But those person-to-person relationships, that interpersonal relationship, they're so important. Tim, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but you had a point to make.
Okay. I was quite taken by Rebecca's comments about her own story. 100 years ago, my ancestors came out from Transylvania, and a lot of you will think that's all to do with Dracula, and that's why I'm an economist, because they're all bloodsuckers. My family had a paddle steamer called the Wanderer Jew and a series of general stores in country New South Wales. And they became very close friends with the local Aborigines and also the local Chinese who were actually in country New South Wales. And my neighbour in Sydney was actually the granddaughter of the Chinese family that my great-grandparents sold the general store to in Lismore 100 years ago. And so what I love about Australia is that multiculturalism is not new.
Yes.
It's part of our history. Same with Canada, Chris. And my family is Jewish, Scottish, Irish, Romanian, Chinese, Taiwanese, Italian. So we do Christmas, Hanukkah, Chinese New Year, 4th of July, you name it.
Lots of holidays.
Yes, Tim's on permanent holiday.
And so what I find interesting was that when we asked Chinese students about coming to Australia, they actually said, we don't want to just hang around with Chinese students. We actually are quite interested in Anglo-Aussies and Thais and Indonesians and Canadians and the whole mix. And I think that's, Rebecca, I thought, showed that very clearly, that having the mix of people so that you don't go from, Chengdu and only hang around with Sichuan people. Yeah. Otherwise, why leave home? So part of the adventure is discovering new people and new things. The people mixing together is terrific. I mean, not many people know that Kathy Freeman, the great Aboriginal runner, has a Chinese ancestor. And Mickey O'Loughlin, the great Aussie rules footballer, has a Polish-Jewish grandfather. So I think Penny Wong has a Chinese Malaysian father and an Anglo-Australian mother. So I think as we mix in our society, then that becomes a great strength.
You're watching and listening to China Chat. Today's topic is education, and my excellent guests include Yilan Wu. You started this with the importance of multiculturalism, and I think when you meet students coming out for the first time, I'd like to know how you see they develop as they spend a year or more in Australia. What changes do you see in their perception about this place and their connection with China?
For themselves, they become more independent because for most students, they come here, it's their first time to living alone and fully depend themselves. And most of us have completely no idea about this country.
What was your idea when you came out?
Yeah, it's a Western country, maybe just like the US or the UK.
Yeah.
I know nothing deeply about this. But after arriving, I think it's a very positive land, and people are friendly, and I know more like the people here are more sporty, I think, and it affected me a lot, make me more keen on doing sport and having a healthy lifestyle.
And that was a big change for you, do you think?
Yes, I think for most Chinese students, they learn more sport thing here rather than back in China. Yeah.
Of course, coming out to a country is a big deal. Learning how to find a place, pay rent, pick up the language, make friends. How much is it about building resilience and building yourself as a resilient person?
It's very important.
Yeah.
because it's the first time you're living alone and you need to be resilient, or you cannot handle the stuff, but you need to be, and you will culture yourself or to push yourself become more resilient. And you also learn how to depend on your friends, to make more friends to help you, more open to their help as well.
Rebecca, do you agree on that?
I totally agree. I was actually nodding and laughing and thinking about like my own experience when I first came to Australia, because I was one of the I wouldn't say spoiled, but definitely very well supported Chinese kid before I came to Australia, and I and I also got actually food poisoned by myself because I couldn't cook very well, and I ate something I cooked by myself, and I went to the hospital. I had to see a doctor after that, and it was disastrous.
Your cooking was that bad?
I cooked something, and it was not fully cooked, and it was just didn't even taste well. And then I also poisoned myself. Didn't tell my parents, of course, otherwise they're gonna be worried so much. So I think that's also a process for Chinese students to learn like how to be resilient. And I see that as a very important aspect in particularly like to study abroad and to live in a foreign country.
We're on the homeward leg now for this edition of China Chat. I'd like to turn to both Tim and Chris, because both of you are still at the coalface. And I think one of the important things that everyone remembers is the importance of a great teacher. So, Chris, if I start with you, why do you get a buzz out of teaching and passing on your knowledge?
You know, at the end of the day, there's a very selfish reason, and that is you learn the best through teaching other people. And so I take teaching very seriously because I want to learn. I always want to learn more. I would have been a student for my whole life if they let me.
Education is the driver of knowledge, and that's how we develop innovation and productivity in a society. You know, it's not everything, but ultimately it is everything. And in terms of international education, I was really inspired by Rebecca's words. I think it's terrific that someone from China, from a very different system, can come to Australia and participate in an open democracy. And it just shows that I think that people can come to Australia from all over the world and become fully participants in our democracy and in our economy and in our society, no matter where they come from, no matter what the system that they came from. So that gives me good reasons for optimism. And I mean, ultimately, look, there's 300 million middle-class people in China who will want an education. Some will go to the US, some will go to the UK, some will come here to Australia, and many will stay and become fantastic Aussies that we've seen so many of.
Tim, thank you. Yilam, we began with you. Let me give you the last word. If you were to sum up the importance of international education, what it's given you, how would you put it?
I think education is more like about fostering or forming your values instead of only gaining knowledge. So it's a great and unique experience for me, and also for other students, even they do not realize that part. So to improve the education, especially for the international students here, I think the government of uni should focus more on supporting students' physical and psychological health, and make them feel more supported.
And the benefit to the students and the benefits to a country like Australia?
This win-win. I definitely agree with Rebecca's point, because they do not only contribute economically, they pay high tuition fee, they also contribute their culture to the social diversity here.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Chris, thank you, Tim, thank you, Rebecca. A wide-ranging discussion, all of it interesting. Join us again for China Chat. Next time will be a very interesting subject indeed.